Howdy, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. And be sure to hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Hope you enjoy this.
Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live, and a very happy feast day to you. Today is the Feast of All Saints, one of the great feasts, one of the ancient feasts of the Catholic Church, when we remember all the saints of the Catholic Church. And that means that we're off today, actually, because these big feasts we take off here at Catholic Answers when they fall on a weekday. And so a little pre-record for you today. Jimmy Akin, our guest, both hours. And both hours, internet open forum. We got lots and lots of questions. This is one thing we have no shortage of around here, questions. And they come in all different ways, and Jimmy gathers up the internet questions, and we get to ask him today. So I will probably, as I usually say, I will probably give out the number, but when I do, that will be a mistake because we don't have phones today. It's all from the internet. Jimmy Akin is the senior apologist here at Catholic Answers. Many, many people know him from Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, the very popular podcast that tackles mysteries of all kinds. And now, also the proprietor of the Jimmy Akin podcast. Hello, Jimmy Akin.
Howdy, Si. Now, you mentioned that we tend to take off not just major feasts, but holy days of obligation.
Oh, yeah.
When they occur on weekdays. And the flip side of that is we don't take off a lot of federal holidays. So, if it may be some federal holiday, we're busy at work, but we take off the holy days instead.
Yeah, which is actually I kind of like that in a certain way because of the traffic. Mm-hmm. I get that, like when you're working on a federal holiday, it is just a smooth breeze coming into work. But
I've noticed that I encounter very little traffic on those days on the route from my bedroom to my home office.
Yeah, it's a little bit less of a commute for you. I get the old COVID feeling back. Remember when we were commuting in here with COVID? The clear freeways of California. I don't want to get too nostalgic about a worldwide pandemic. However, how about what's on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World this week?
Well, we kind of have an expanded Halloween celebration, and so we're doing Halloween weird questions. A while back, we did a weird question show for Halloween. We used the first hour of it last Friday. We used the second hour of it this Friday, so kind of an extra long Halloween, to borrow a quote from Batman, The Long Halloween.
Is that I don't.
It's a story arc.
Oh, okay. All right. You can check out Jim. Well, I'll ask you in a little bit about the Jimmy Akin podcast, because now that we've got so many things to refer to, I got to space them out a little bit. But check out Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World at mysterious.fm or wherever you get your podcasts, or check it out on YouTube. Jimmy has so much stuff available for you on YouTube. Check it out there. All right, Jimmy. Here's a question for you. Humble Servant 0707 asks, I was in an OCIA class last week, and Abraham's sons were brought up. One proclaimed Sarah's push for Abraham to have a baby caused the world problems through Ishmael's line till today. Can you elaborate? Is that line cursed, or is this some consequence to Sarah and Abraham's impatience?
Well, we don't have evidence that the line of Ishmael's cursed. There's no reference to a curse being placed upon it in Genesis. In fact, God says good things about it. He says it's not going to be the line of promise that's going to come not through Ishmael, but through Isaac. But, when Ishmael's born, it's made clear he's going to be the father of a great people. And according to Genesis, that happened. They had various, national ethnic groups coming from Ishmael. These groups had a sometimes good, sometimes bad relationship with the Israelites. There are passages that will talk about Edomites, Edom being another name for Ishmael. But there are passages that say things like, don't despise an Edomite, for he is your brother. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there are other passages where the Edomites failed to come to Israel's help militarily, and those speak more negatively It's like, you guys weren't there for us when we needed you, and you just stood back and laughed at our military troubles, and you're going to get some judgment for that. But this is not different than the way God treats Israel. When they obey God and do good, they get blessings. When they disobey God and do bad, they get less blessings. Mm-hmm. I think that part of this situation is, or part of the modern interpretation of this is that it is commonly reputed today that Arabs are descended from Ishmael. And in fact, there are Muslim sources that claim this, that will say, oh no, it wasn't through Isaac that the line of blessing continued, it was through Ishmael. And there are stories about, in the Muslim community, about things Abraham did with Ishmael. And because there's a fractious relationship today between Muslims and Jews, people could look at that and say, oh, that's caused problems for us down to today. Well, okay, there are two things I'd say in regard to that. The first one is that we don't have evidence for a curse here. You know, this is, even assuming that Arabs are descended from Ishmael, it's just normal fractious Middle East politics. You know, different groups have advantages and disadvantages over time. They get into conflicts, they reconcile, they get back into conflicts. And we're currently living in a conflict phase because of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. But there's nothing specially cursed going on here. This is just par for the course. The second thing I'd say is, I don't know that Arabs are really descended from Ishmael. Muhammad may have believed that they were, but I would want to see more proof than that. Now, there may be studies dealing with this. I have not investigated those studies, so I don't have a firm opinion here. But just because someone in the Middle East claims to be descended from someone else doesn't mean it's an accurate historical memory. In fact, we can trace the development of different ethnic groups in the Middle East and who they claim to be descended from. And sometimes it's obvious they're not all descended from who they say. They create, because these are patriarchal societies, they organize their culture by genealogy. And so if you're going to have tight relations with some group, you need to somehow share the same genealogy, and they will have genealogical mergers. And they'll refer to people being genealogized when they get written into the genealogy, and they'll be attributed this is sort of a after-death legal adoption. They will be attributed to being descendants of some ancient ancestor, and say, yeah, we're all sons of him, even though the tie is really a legal one. It's like adoption, not a biological tie. So I don't know that Arabs actually carry Ishmael's genes, but I do know that they regard themselves, legally at least, as children of Abraham through Ishmael.
Humble Servant 0707, thank you very much for the question, for getting us started. It's an Ask Me Anything of the internet variety with Jimmy Akin today on Catholic Answers Live.
Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Magnificat. Published monthly, Magnificat features texts of daily Mass, prayers, articles, meditations, art commentaries, and more, in step with the liturgical rhythm of the Church, on the web at magnificat.com.
Hey, this is Michael O'Neill, the Miracle Hunter. I'll be delving into the fascinating world of miracles and taking you on a hunt that explores the greatest mysteries and marvels of the Catholic Church. I'll be examining what constitutes a miracle, how miracles are investigated and approved, and the role they play in the lives of the faithful. We'll look at the miracles of the Gospels and early Christianity, considering the claims of the miraculous in our own modern age.
The Miracle Hunter, tomorrow at 1 p.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. It is All Saints Day, and I hope you're having a beautiful All Saints Day. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and we have a million questions for Jimmy, all from the internet today. This one comes from, here I go. Esmeralda Caffey Clatch 8812. Caffey Clatch. Why is the ascension, in quotation marks, necessary?
So the ascension of Jesus into heaven is one of the elements of God's plan, but we have to qualify what we mean in terms of necessary, because God is omnipotent and therefore he can do anything he chooses. And that includes redeeming us and providing us all the blessings without Jesus ascending to heaven. So it's not necessary from an ultimate perspective. But in terms of what God chose, it does have purposes, and you could say it's necessary in that sense. One of the things that Jesus says in the Gospel of John is that when he goes away, he's going to prepare a place for the disciples. He says, in my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. If it weren't so, I would have told you. So he's going to do something to get heaven ready for his followers. Also, he says it's profitable for you that I go, because if I don't, you won't receive the Holy Spirit. So the bestowal of the Holy Spirit by God's choice was contingent on Jesus being ascended into heaven. And so those are the two things that I'm aware of that we're told are to our benefit. That Jesus is going to get heaven ready for us, and that he's going to send the Holy Spirit to us. You could propose additional things, because we do know additional stuff about what Jesus is doing in heaven. We know that he is reigning in heaven, as St. Paul says, until all of his enemies are put under are made his footstool, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death. So you could propose that there are additional processes, like the defeat of all the powers opposed to Jesus, including ultimately death, that also are related to Jesus's ascension into heaven. It's a little more speculative in those cases, because Jesus doesn't just tell us, but you could speculate about those things if you want, and so feel free.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Esmeralda, for that question. It's internet open forum. This one comes from eRock5B. Some saints were said to have levitated. Mm-hmm. Will our resurrected bodies have abilities like levitation, telekinesis, etc.?
Okay, so it's true that various saints are reported to have levitated, and we actually have good evidence for that. There are some cases, like St. Joseph of Cupertino and St. Teresa of Avila, where we just have lots of witnesses. Even in Thomas Aquinas's case, we have a few witnesses, but with like Joseph of Cupertino, he was levitating all the time. There were tons of witnesses, and we have statements from him. In fact, Joseph of Cupertino and St. Teresa of Avila were both investigated by inquisitions to see if they were faking. And so we have, expert witness testimony and things like that from people who saw them levitate in and could describe the way it happened. In terms of will our resurrected bodies have such abilities? Well, we're not told. So, I can't say for 100%, but the common theological opinion, and this would be my hope and expectation, is that we will have those abilities also. One way I could support that is by noting that Jesus levitated. He ascended into heaven. We're told that. That was our previous question. And we're told in the New Testament that in the resurrection, we're going to be like Jesus. So if he was able to levitate in glorious form, I would expect, I can't prove, but I would expect that we would be able to do the same thing. So that deals with eRock 5B's question about levitation. He also asked about telekinesis. Telekinesis is, for people who may not be familiar, is a reference to the ability to paranormally control matter with the mind. It's often called mind over matter. This term actually is not used really these days in parapsychology. Instead, the preferred term is psychokinesis. Psyche in Greek means mind, and kinesis means motion. So psychokinesis or psychokinesis would be mentally caused motion. Telekinesis, tele means distant, like in television, distant vision, or telephone, distant sound. And one of the things that parapsychologists have found is psychokinesis doesn't always operate at a distance. Sometimes you're doing it close up. You might be having an effect. This is known as micropsychokinesis or psychokinesis on the small scale, but you might be affecting the operation of an electronic device you're holding in your hand. That's still mind over matter. It's still psychokinesis, but it's not a distant object because it's right there in your hand. So that's just a terminological note. But you'll note that levitation is itself a form of psychokinesis. You're mentally manipulating the body so that it rises up off the ground. And so given that we would assuming we have levitation, it would, and can levitate our own bodies, it would be a logical extension of that to propose that we'll also have the ability to manipulate matter mentally. Now, can't say that for 100%, because we're making an additional inference here, and every time you make an additional inference, the confidence level goes down because it's an additional layer of speculation. But I would say it's a reasonable speculation.
All right, eRock5B, thank you very much for the question. We are marching through these questions today. Well, you are, Jimmy. This one comes from myalt-x2h. What if the Pope breaks the seal of confession? Is he excommunicated? Who would he be excommunicated from?
Okay, so now, God forbid the Pope or any priest should ever break the seal of confession, but if it happens, it carries with it an automatic penalty of excommunication. And so if the Pope broke the seal of confession, he would be excommunicated and would incur the penalties of that, which I'll talk about in a minute. Excommunication, though, is not a separation from the church. This is a common misunderstanding. Excommunication has a number of effects legally, but being kicked out of the church is actually not one of them. So the Pope would not be excommunicated from any person as the head of the church. He wouldn't be kicked out of the church. I assume that's what's going on in the background of the question. Mm-hmm. If you're thinking of excommunication as being separated from the church, and the Pope being in communion with the Pope is how you're in the church, who would he separate from? If he was excommunicated, that wouldn't make any sense. And you're right, it wouldn't make any sense, but that's not one of the effects of excommunication. There are two types of excommunication that are provided for in the Code of Canon Law. One of them is called late sententiae excommunication. That gets commonly glossed in English as automatic excommunication. And the other is known as ferende sententiae excommunication, which gets glossed in English as imposed excommunication. And they have different effects. If someone is excommunicated late sententiae or automatically, which is the kind of excommunication provided for by breaking the seal, then they're not supposed to do things like place acts of governance until they get their situation remedied. So they're not supposed to make laws or give orders or make administrative decisions. They're supposed to chill until they get their excommunication lifted. But here's the thing. They are still allowed to do so. They're not supposed to, but they still can, unless the excommunication has been declared ferende sententiae, or unless it's been imposed. So what would happen if the Pope broke the seal of confession, is he would get automatic excommunication, and he would be in a state where he's not supposed to be governing the church, but he still can govern the church. And there wouldn't be a ferende sententiae excommunication because it would involve judging the Pope, and under canon law, no one is allowed to judge the Pope. So you couldn't impose this excommunication. So he would be able to, he'd still be a member of the church, he'd still be able to govern the church. What he really should do is chill on the governing stuff and repent and get the excommunication lifted, which he could do himself. But just answering the question in terms of how it's posed, that would be the answer.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much. Now I got to remember who that was. That was my Alt-X2H, and it's such a beautiful name. I don't want to get it wrong. We're returning now to Humble Servant 0707. Is the war in Israel / Hamas prophesied in the Bible?
Absolutely not. There is a tendency on the part of folks today, anytime anything notable happens in Israel, to wonder if it's prophesied in the Bible. And the answer is no. There's basically no explicit prophecy, or very little explicit prophecy, about the modern state of Israel. There is so little that it's not even clear to Jewish scholars if the modern state of Israel is mentioned at all in the Bible. So now in the New Testament, which includes books that Jewish scholars don't recognize as canonical, Jesus is asked a question at the beginning of Acts where Peter says to him, are you going to at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Because they were under Roman rule at the time, and they had an expectation that at some point God would give them their nation back. They'd have home rule again. And Jesus says it's not for you to know the times that God has determined. You need to focus on your task. But he doesn't reject the idea that Israel will one day again be its own entity with its own rule, not under some other nation's authority. And so you could propose that the modern state of Israel reflects a fulfillment of a prophecy along these lines, that, they got their land back, they're not under anybody else's authority, so maybe the expectation that the disciples had that Jesus didn't reject constitutes a kind of prophecy of one day Israel will get its land back and be able to rule itself. On the other hand, you could challenge that, because you could say, well, yeah, they got their land back, but now they're a secular state. They're not ruled by a king. They're ruled in an entirely secular way, and so maybe this is something that was not prophecy. Maybe this is just an accident of history. However you look at that question, there is absolutely nothing about Hamas in the Bible. Hamas is a modern terrorist organization, and it is completely absent from the Bible. Therefore, the current dust-up between Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Hezbollah on their northern front, neither of those is mentioned in the Bible. So we should not attribute prophetic significance to them.
Thanks, humble servant. Thanks very much. Dust-up is one of the great American coinages. That's we invented that, and I'm very proud of us for that. Yeah. I think we got time to do Census Fidelium 9510's question. Jimmy Aiken is our guest. It's an Ask Me Anything. I'd like to know the church's view on the union dock worker strike. Is it okay to stop working in this situation? What roles does the union play in society?
The church does not have any kind of teaching on the union dock worker strike that happened. In terms of the role of unions in society, well, basically they're collective bargaining agencies, and the church, recognizes a right of people to organize for negotiation. That right is not absolute, but it recognizes that people can organize if they feel that's the best way to arrive at a good settlement for them and their group. And is it okay to stop work in this situation? Well, I'm not a student of the union dock strike, so I don't know what their grievances were or what they were trying to achieve. But it is in principle legitimate to say at some point, work is a negotiation. And if you're not going to meet my demands, I'm not going to do work for you. So both sides, at which point the owner of a business may say, okay, I'll find someone else, and I'm not going to meet your demands. You're welcome to stop work. On the other hand, if he doesn't want to lose the labor, then when the labor says, if you don't meet our demands, we're going to stop work. Well, if you don't want them to stop, and if you don't want to have to replace them with someone else, then you will need to meet their demands, or both sides will need to move at least a little bit and meet in the middle somewhere.
Census Fidelium, thanks very much for the question. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's an Ask Me Anything. All the questions this hour and next have come from the internet. We get lots of internet questions. More of them for Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live. What was the church like in its infancy? In a word, Catholic. And Joe Heschmeyer has the receipts. In his best-selling book, The Early Church Was the Catholic Church, he gives you the details from the historical records of the first 2 centuries of Christianity. Right now, get a copy for just $10, plus free shipping if you live in the continental United States. Get more information and order The Early Church Was the Catholic Church at theearlychurchwascatholic.com.
Is orthodoxy an alternative to the Catholic Church? In a time of uncertainty for many Catholics, orthodoxy can look like greener pastures. Answering Orthodoxy, the new book from Catholic Answers Press, explains why Catholics who are thinking of leaving need to think twice. There are important reasons to remain in the Catholic Church and convincing answers to Orthodox claims. Order your copy of Answering Orthodoxy today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Is the Catholic faith still a rock amidst the waves of history? Why does it so often seem to be a mess? In his latest book, Confusion in the Kingdom, best-selling author Trent Horn helps you to get to the roots of the present chaos, explaining the destabilizing movements within Catholicism and exposing the harm and scandal progressive Catholicism has caused. Order your copy of Confusion in the Kingdom today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. All Saints Day version, and all the questions today for Jimmy Akin are internet questions. They've all come to us one way or another through those electronic means, and Jimmy gathers them up for us, and then I get to ask him the questions on the air. I mentioned earlier Jimmy has a podcast, the Jimmy Akin podcast. Can you tell us just about the podcast and maybe what people could find this week over on the Jimmy Akin podcast?
So the Jimmy Akin podcast is focused on apologetics, or broadly understood. It'll cover theology and biblical studies and stuff like that. It's more like what I do here on Catholic Answers Live than it is what I do on Mysterious World. The tagline for it is that we, on the Jimmy Akin podcast, we discuss the mysteries of the faith. So it's faith-based content particularly. It's different than what I do here on Catholic Answers Live, though, in a couple of respects. One of them is I can go a little longer than I can when I'm answering a brief radio call-in question. And secondly, it's prescripted. So I can do my research, I can add graphics and things like that to help illustrate what I'm talking about. So I don't have to do it just all off the top of my head the way I do here. So it's faith-based. I'm allowed to do more in-depth answers than I can here on Catholic Answers Live, and I'm able to add things to them, add things to those answers that I can't really do here on Catholic Answers Live. And in terms of what dropped this week, it's guaranteed to come out on Mondays. We may also have bonus episodes later in the week, but it's always coming out on Monday. And this last Monday, we had a video drop on what I call the Jonah death hypothesis. There have been a number of people lately in Catholic circles who have been maintaining that Jonah died in the whale and was dead for 3 days and then rose from the dead. And that's a more exact parallel to Jesus than what Christians have historically supposed. So in this week's episode, I talk about the Jonah death hypothesis and why it's catastrophically wrong. I first go through the arguments favoring the Jonah death hypothesis that its advocates make, and I show that they don't carry force. And then I review the book of Jonah and the whale's function in the book of Jonah. And I reveal that the Jonah death hypothesis fundamentally misunderstands what the whale is doing in the book of Jonah. The whale has a very specific function, and its function is not for Jonah to be dead inside of it. In fact, it's the whale that saves Jonah from drowning. Yeah. So you can check that out and find out what the arguments are in favor of the Jonah death hypothesis and why the whole thing is colossally wrong.
Still, I feel like after 3 days you would need such a shower. I mean, how gross.
Oh, I'm not disputing that.
I mean, even if it's like Geppetto and, what was the guy's name? Pinocchio. Do you remember Pinocchio and Geppetto in the whale? Still, 3 days in a whale. Come on. All right, check it out. Well, first of all, you can check it out on YouTube. It's all that content is on YouTube, but you can also find it wherever you find your favorite podcast, the Jimmy Akin podcast. Another question from eRock5B. After the bodily resurrection, do we live in heaven, the new earth, or some combination of the two?
The answer that's presented in the book of Revelation, and it's based on earlier passages like from the book of Isaiah, but specifically in Revelation, it depicts resurrected humanity as living on the new earth, which is united with the new heaven. So the separation of heaven and earth that we experience now is not envisioned to continue into the future. So that's what Revelation presents us with. We're going to be on the new earth, which will be united with the new heaven. So it's really a combination of both.
All right, eRock5B, thank you very much for the question. This question comes from Blind Owl John 70. I feel like if your name is Blind Owl John, you better be able to play saxophone or slide guitar or something.
Harmonica.
Yeah, but you better have some kind of a cool instrument that you can play. All right, Blind Owl John 75 wants to know this. Hi, Jimmy. Why were there guards stationed at the tomb of Jesus if Jews only believed in resurrection at the end of the world? Doesn't this imply that the Jewish authorities at least thought Jesus' followers believed Jesus could rise from the dead? Do you think his disciples believed he would rise after 3 days?
Well, okay, so we got a few questions here. The first one is that we probably ought to address is, did Jews believe that the dead would be raised only at the end of the world? And broadly speaking, the answer is yes. It was not a broad Jewish expectation that there would be a resurrection prior to the end of the world. Having said that, Jesus predicted that he would rise in 3 days, and the Jewish authorities knew that. By the way, not all of the Jewish authorities would have believed in resurrection to begin with, because some of them were Sadducees, like the high priest Caiaphas, and they didn't believe in an afterlife. They thought when you die, you're just worm food. So they didn't not all of them believed in the resurrection, even at the end of the world, but they knew that Jesus had said he would rise in 3 days. And that didn't mean that they thought the disciples believed he would rise in 3 days. They may have conjectured that, but what they're actually afraid of, according to Matthew, is that the disciples are going to come and steal the body and so he won't be raised in 3 days. But his disciples, based on his statement that he would be raised in 3 days, might steal the body and then try to pass it off as if he had been raised from the dead. And consequently, and then they say, and the latter deception will be worse than the former. So what they're trying to stop is the disciples stealing the body. And that would mean at least the core disciples knew he was not going to be raised. Otherwise, why bother stealing the body? So they're not envisioning the disciples or the core disciples believing he's going to rise, but that they're going to use Jesus's statement from when he was alive to pull a hoax on people. The last question then is, do I think Jesus believed he would rise after 3 days? So that's in the future. And the answer we get from the Gospels is no. In none of the Gospels do we have anybody who's expecting the resurrection. The women who find the tomb empty are not expecting the resurrection. They're going there to anoint Jesus's body with spices. When they then report the resurrection to the core disciples, the males, they're not initially believed, and then even when the women, come and make the initial report, they think that, someone like a gardener maybe has moved Jesus's body. So they don't think he's been raised. And then when Jesus himself actually shows up, the disciples interpret him as a ghost. Mm-hmm. That's their fallback position. So they still, his spirit is here, but they don't think it's his body until he lets them handle him and he eats food in front of them and stuff like that. So their first hypothesis is they think he's in the tomb. When that turns out not to be true, their second hypothesis is they think somebody moved the body. And then when that turns out not to be true, they think he's a ghost. That's their third hypothesis. So it's not until we get to the fourth hypothesis that they conclude he really has been raised. And that's a testament to how strong the belief in resurrection on the last day only was in Jewish circles, that they burn through three other hypotheses before they arrive at the truth.
Blind L. John, thanks very much for the question. This one comes from Adam I4H8D. Am I supposed to put that together into some kind of... No. Adam I4H8D. All right. Jimmy Aiken, do you think that Jesus received any grace when he ate the Eucharist? I know he is the source of grace, but he was strengthened by an angel in the agony in the garden. Curious to hear your thoughts on what's happening in both of these instances on a metaphysical or ontological level.
Okay, so the first thing to say is I don't know that Jesus received communion at the Last Supper because it doesn't say he did. He may have, but what it says is that he took bread and broke it and gave it to the disciples and told them to eat it. And similarly, it says that he took the cup and gave it to them and told them to drink it. So it's not for 100% based on the text that I could say he definitely took communion. I believe he did. I just couldn't prove it, so I want to note that. But assuming he did, could he receive grace? Well, in his divine nature, he is the source of grace, and thus has infinite sanctifying grace in his divine nature. The question is about his human nature. Could he have received great additional grace in his human nature? And here, I would say the answer is yes, and I would point to Adam's own reference to how he was strengthened by an angel during the agony of the garden. He was also ministered to by angels during the temptation in the wilderness, and so that shows us that his physical form, as part of his human nature, had highs and lows in terms of strength, and so he could be strengthened by angels. He could be weakened by fasting for 40 days, or he could be weakened in his human nature by the agony of knowing what was going to be coming upon him in a few hours. So we see ups and downs in levels of strength. And if we see that, then I think the same thing could be true of sanctifying grace. Now, Jesus will never be weakened in sanctifying grace, because in order to get rid of sanctifying grace, you have to commit sin, and Jesus never did that. But I would say that he could have additional amounts of sanctifying grace poured into his human nature. At least I can imagine that happening. And so if he did receive the Eucharist, and the Eucharist normally conveys sanctifying grace, then I could see Jesus' human nature acquiring additional sanctifying grace beyond that which it already had. Having said that, this is a speculative area. The church doesn't have a teaching here as far as I'm aware, and so people could hold different opinions on this.
Adam, thank you. Brought us right up to the break, but thank you very much for the question. Lots more questions to come. It's Ask Me Anything, Internet Variety with Jimmy Akin today on Catholic Answers Live.
Hello, this is Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco. Keep your dial tuned to Catholic Answers Live.
In Morse code, the sequence SOS is a distress call. It's been said that it stands for Save Our Souls. Well, right now our world is in big trouble, and we're putting out an SOS call for help. Will you answer that call? St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, has hundreds of teams who share the good news with souls who don't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to get involved.
EWTN Radio posts 11 podcasts every weekday and over 60 per week. They're the perfect companion for busy Catholics everywhere. With on-demand access to audio, you can pause and pick up right where you left off anytime, anywhere. And they're all free. Subscribe by going to EWTNradio.net. Then click on podcasts. They're waiting for you. EWTN is the global Catholic network.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest, both hours today on this Feast of All Saints in the Catholic Church. We're awful glad you're here with us on the feast day. And then this next question comes from Cristobal Gomez Gutierrez, 8546. And here's the question. Are there instructions or limits to cursing? My intuition is that it is bad. But Jesus did curse a fig tree and said, "Woe to whom betrayed him." Was it okay because he's God? Furthermore, would it be bad to curse a war, and what would be the effect? God bless you and the reader. I'm the reader, so thank you very much, Cristobal.
Okay, so the first thing I'll mention is I actually have an episode of Mysterious World where I talk about curses. It's episode 126. So you can go to mysterious.fm/126 and listen to that for more background. But in terms of cursing, the first thing we've got to do is discuss what type of cursing we're talking about, because the term gets used in colloquial English to refer to more than the classical understanding of cursing. The classical understanding is you say something bad about a person or thing in hopes of that bad thing coming true. So, like, to quote Johnny Carson's The Great Karnak, may your armpits be filled with 1,000,000 fleas. Mm-hmm. That would be a curse. A lot of what we think of as cursing today, like particularly when you hear people talking about cussing, because cussing is just an alternate pronunciation of cursing. They think it means using bad words like bathroom words or things like that. And that is not cussing. That is not cursing, properly speaking. That's vulgarity. Vulgarity is using the language of common men. Common men or vulgar people use bad language. And that's vulgarity, but it's not profanity, which is desecrating holy things. And it's not cursing, which is wishing ill on someone. Well, okay, Jesus did curse a fig tree. And he did so really to make a point. He was doing an object lesson. He found the fig tree, and you can determine this by looking, for example, at how it's treated in Mark. Mark is known for having sequences of material that are referred to as Markan sandwiches, where he'll take one part of a story, and then he'll have an interruption in the story, and then he'll have the second part of the story, and that's called a Markan sandwich. And what you do in a Markan sandwich is you relate the framing story that's at the beginning and the end to the central part of the story that's different. So in Mark, the earliest version of this we have, Jesus finds the fig tree. It's putting on a big show. It's got leaves, which suggests that even though the time for mature figs isn't here yet, it should have on it these kind of proto-figs that figs put out, but he doesn't find anything. It's all show. It's just a bunch of leaves. And so he curses it and says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. Then he goes to the temple and clears it. And then they come back and see the fig tree withered. So the two parts of the fig tree narrative are functioning as a commentary on the temple narrative and the cleansing of the temple. So Jesus goes to the temple. It's putting on a big show. We got a great temple to worship God here, but they're corrupting it with selling stuff where people are supposed to be allowed to pray and stuff like that. That's why he refers to the statement in the Old Testament that my house is meant to be a house of prayer for the nations. Well, there was a court of the Gentiles where Gentiles could come and pray to God, but they were filling it up with buyers and sellers. So they were, in other words, putting on a big religious show here, but they didn't have any spiritual fruit to bear, to present. And consequently, the cursing of the fig tree serves as an enacted parable of the cursing of the temple and how the temple is ultimately going to be destroyed. So in cursing the fig tree, basically Jesus destroyed an inanimate object in order to teach a spiritual lesson. It'd be kind of like getting a chainsaw and cutting the tree down. He could have done that too, and that would have made the point as well. So it's not that he curses it, is the issue. He's got a reason for doing it, and it's just an inanimate object. It therefore can be destroyed for an important purpose, like teaching a spiritual lesson, whether you do that with a curse or whether you do that with a chainsaw. When it comes to him saying woe to the one who betrays him, woe is not itself, it's not necessarily a curse. Woe is just an expression of misfortune. And it can even be an expression of sympathy. Something bad has happened to this person. So if you say woe to this person, you're not adding to their woe, you're expressing their woe. And so I wouldn't view that as necessarily a curse. You could read it as one if he was somehow adding to Judas's punishment, but that's not the sense I get from the text. He's not adding to Judas's sentence. He's just expressing some really unfortunate stuff is going to happen to the person who betrays me. When it comes to, are there instructions or limits to cursing? Well, this has actually been discussed. There's not really a church teaching here, so different theologians can have different opinions. But if you look in the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas Aquinas has a whole section on cursing, and he notes properly that curses themselves have no effect. So you mentioned what would happen if you cursed a war. What would be the effect? Well, there wouldn't be any effect just from the fact you say, dang this war. Mm-hmm. Curses only have effect if someone with power acts on the curse. Now, so who could act on a curse? Well, it could be a demon, but we're not supposed to have any dealings with them. So have no truck with demons. Don't mess with them. It could be an angel, if God assigns the angel to act on a curse, or it could be God himself who acts on the curse. So if you can find a curse that corresponds to the will of God, it would not be sinful to pronounce it. and God could make it effective. But you got to be really careful in doing that. And St. Thomas Aquinas talks about that. You don't just go around cursing people or things for no reason. If you've got a reason that corresponds to the will of God, then you could curse. But in general, you don't have such reasons. And in general, you want to take the attitude that Jesus recommends, which is bless those who persecute you rather than curse them. Say good things about them and ask God to give them good things, even though they're doing bad stuff to you. We want a universal ethic of love where we try to help everybody. Now, that's not to say there may not be situations where a curse would be warranted, but it is to say, like, if just like we want to love everybody, we don't want to have to shoot people dead. But if a murderer breaks into your home and is at the point of killing your family, you could shoot him dead as part of legitimate self-defense. And in the same way, we want a universal ethic of love where we bless people and don't curse them. That's not to say there are no imaginable situations where a curse could be warranted, but it is to say they're very exceptional.
All right. Thank you, Cristobal, very much for the question. This one comes from Bobby Johnson, 6410. When death occurs suddenly, and the incident is faster than the brain can comprehend, as in the case of a submarine implosion, does God give a grace of awareness to the victim, or is it possible for the soul to be confused at the judgment seat of Christ?
Well, we're not told the answer to this in Scripture. So we have to, if we want to try to get any data about this, we have to look at extra scriptural evidence, like what it can be gleaned from near-death experiences that people have. When Bobby says, does God give a grace of awareness to the victim? What he means is an instant grace of awareness, because it could be that the soul could be confused, and then when it goes before Jesus at the judgment seat, then it learns, oh, okay, you're dead, and now it's time for judgment. So what he's imagining is an instant awareness of the fact that I'm dead. And the evidence we have from near-death experiences suggests that the answer to that is no. That there are situations where people report being confused about whether they're dead or alive. And it can take, so they're not given an instant awareness. They will eventually learn that, okay, you're dead and now we have some stuff to deal with, but it appears it is not necessarily instantaneous. And so some people can be confused, at least for a period of time, once they have died, about exactly what happened to them and the fact they are dead. So it appears from the data we have, which is all extra biblical, that there's not an immediate instant enlightenment about all of these things, and there is a learning process that can still be required in the afterlife, or at least the early afterlife.
That's when you might want to rely on the old guardian angel for some help there. Wow, that's such a great question. We've never had that question on the show before. At least that I remember. It's a wonderful question, Bobby. Thank you. So many wonderful questions from folks. And Jimmy Aiken here to answer them all, not just this hour, but next hour as well. Today is All Saints Day, the Feast of All Saints. It is the day when we remember all the saints in the Catholic Church. It's a holy day. We go to Mass today. And so all of our questions are already in. They have come to us via the internet. If you're just catching us...
Are you vamping to get to the end of the hour, or are you going to ask me the next question?
No, I'm not going to ask you. I'm going to get to the end of the hour.
Okay, vamp away then.
There's like 14 seconds. I mean, I could, but it seemed like
I'm just trying to know what to expect. So
yeah, Well, let me
That's
think
fine.
this through. How would I vamp if I wanted to vamp? I would probably say, let me think this through. How would I vamp if I wanted to vamp all the way to the end of the hour?
Oh, Jimmy, you're getting recursive now.
Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything, but it's an Ask Me Anything of the internet variety. All the questions are already in. We've already had a whole bunch of great ones. We've got a bunch of great ones to come. If you don't know who we are, you can go to Catholic.com and find out all about what we do. We're devoted just to what we're doing right here, answering questions, explaining and defending the Catholic faith. Also, you can visit Jimmy Akin's podcast, just wherever you get your podcasts. Go to the Jimmy Akin podcast. Just search for Jimmy Akin podcast wherever you get your podcast and you'll find it. Or find Mysterious World at mysterious.fm. We'll be right back with lots more questions for Jimmy Akin after this, and no more vamping on Catholic Answers Live.
And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. I'm trying to grow my channel, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless you.